Boldwood presents Snowflakes Over the Second Chances Sweet Shop, written by Hannah Lynn and read by Rosalind Steele. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. Jamie picked up a bar of coconut ice off the shelf and promptly unwrapped it. "You know, I'm sure it's going to be this Christmas," she said, before taking her first sugary mouthful of the sweet. "I can feel it. Evan is going to propose to you this Christmas." Rather than responding straight away, Holly focused on weighing up a large bag of aniseed balls that Jamie had requested. Since falling pregnant, Jamie's sweet tooth had increased no end, and some days Holly was sure her friend spent more time in the sweet shop than she did. "Evan and I are fine as we are," Holly said. She scooped out another handful of the shiny red balls. In Holly's opinion, a lifetime supply of sweets seemed more than fair, given everything Jamie had done for her since she moved back to Borton. It wasn't just that she was Holly's best friend, had offered her a place to live, and been happy for her to stay, even with a newborn baby. Without Jamie and Finn, Holly never would have met Evan. And now, here they were, a year and a half later, going stronger than ever. A lot of things had happened since Holly met Evan at his villa in France, the biggest of which being the pair had bought a house together in the small village of Clapton-on-the-Hill, just outside Borton. It had been a fixer-upper, and that was putting it nicely. The entire place had needed gutting, with new flooring, bathroom, kitchen, and practically every other feature in the place too. In fact, the only things that were the same as when they'd looked around were the fireplaces. It had been a slog, particularly with Hope getting into everything, walking, talking, and generally wanting as much attention as possible, and Evan still having to fly off around the world to keep his business running. But they had got there, and moved in together only 3 weeks ago, giving them plenty of time to get settled in before Christmas, when, for the first time ever, Holly was going to host. With Jamie pregnant, numerous children in attendance, and Caroline's eldest daughter at the age where she loved nothing more than looking after Hope, it was bound to be a special day. Ben and Georgia were also coming, as was Giles, along with Holly's parents. But there was one set of guests that Holly was even more excited, although possibly a little nervous, to meet, and that was Evan's parents, who were flying in from Seattle. It was going to be a full house, and Holly didn't need a proposal to make her life with Evan perfect. It already was. "You know we're happy as we are," she said, reinforcing her point to Jamie. "I don't need a ring. Besides, I don't know why you're saying all this stuff anyway. If Evan was going to propose, he would have already told Finn, and Finn would have told you." She screwed the lid on the jar containing the aniseed balls and placed them back on the shelf. Jamie pressed her lips tightly together. "I know. I thought that too. I don't get it. I think maybe Finn is just not telling me things because he's worried if I get too excited, it'll send me into early labour. Or maybe he's just not telling you things because there's nothing to tell," Holly responded. "Now, is there anything else you want? Or have you just come in to distract me all day?" "Mainly to distract you. I'm not so good at this maternity leave thing. I thought I'd quite like it, you know? Plenty of time to relax and chill and do my own thing, but it's really difficult. I'm used to being so active. You should have seen Finn's face when I said I wanted to go for a bike ride. I swear, if he could, he'd have me sitting in front of the television with my feet up and blankets over me until this baby is born." Holly had to chuckle. Jamie was right. Considering his outgoing lifestyle and the way both he and Jamie approached all adventures in life, Finn had become incredibly cautious the moment they found out about the pregnancy. So much so that he'd insisted Jamie cut back on work, or at least tasks that involved her climbing up and down ladders and fixing people's roofs. Jamie had protested for quite a while, on the account that she'd never had an accident before and saw no reason for it to change just because she was pregnant. But when the bump started growing, shifting her centre of balance, and she'd found it harder to fit her tool belt around her waist, she finally conceded, much to Finn's relief. It was sweet, though, how excited he was. And soon Jamie would have a baby, and Holly wouldn't put it past Ben and Georgia to start trying soon too. Holly and her friends were all in this incredible place of life at the same time. You know, Evan doesn't have to propose for you to start thinking about having children together, Jamie said, breaking Holly's stream of thoughts. You already know from Hope what an amazing dad he'd be. Holly didn't respond, but only because Jamie had vocalised the very thought that had just entered her head. She and Evan had talked about having more children together, but they'd wanted to wait until the house was sorted. Now that was done, there was nothing stopping them. Unless, of course, it had just been a delay tactic by Evan, and he wasn't quite as keen as he first appeared. If that was the case, Holly couldn't blame him. After all, the start of their relationship had been intense enough as it was. Wanting a little downtime was probably natural. Although Jamie was right about one thing. Evan was incredible with Hope. The pair adored each other, and anyone who saw them together would assume he was her biological father. Hope even called his parents Granny and Grandad whenever they called on the phone, though Evan had asked Holly's permission first, and she'd agreed with barely a second thought. She and Evan were in this forever, and when they did have children together, the last thing she wanted was for Hope to feel separate from the rest of his family. So referring to Evan's parents as an extra set of grandparents made sense, especially as they were so keen. It was only when Jamie cleared her throat that Holly realised she'd been standing there for quite some time without responding. "We'll see," she said, which provoked a suitable smirk from Jamie. "Right, I guess I should be off," Jamie said, swinging her bag over her shoulder. "I'm going to one of those antenatal yoga classes they've got going at the gym. You know, the type where you sit on the balls and have to breathe in and out ridiculously slowly." Holly knew the classes very well. She remembered them clearly from her days with Hope, though she couldn't see herself doing them again, if she and Evan were to get pregnant. "Well, have fun. I'll see you later," Holly asked. There was barely an evening that went by when they didn't see one another. "Of course. Love you. Love you too. And remember, I need to be the first person you call when Evan proposes." Holly shook her head and let out a groan as Jamie took the aniseed balls. Jamie turned towards the door, but rather than going outside, she stopped suddenly. "Well, speak of the devil," she said. Chapter 2. For a split second, Holly assumed Jamie was joking. Evan had flown to New York on Tuesday, and she wasn't expecting him back until Sunday night. All the travelling he had to do was the worst part of their relationship, but Evan tried to spend his time away in chunks and get as much work as possible done so that the time he spent back in the Cotswolds was focused on bringing them together, even if that meant he had to spend the day in the sweet shop. In fact, he was now such a common sight behind the till that all the regulars knew him by name, and several of the old ladies seemed terribly disappointed when they showed up and he wasn't working. But today was Friday, 2 days before Evan was due back home, and Holly couldn't believe he would have changed plans without telling her. Yet when a tall figure stepped into the shop and leant down to peck Jamie on the cheek, Holly rushed out from behind the counter, her heart fit to burst. "What are you doing here? I didn't think you were coming home yet." Holly didn't care that this was her workplace and that there were people around. Reaching up on her tiptoes, she planted her lips against Evan's and felt a rush of warmth flood through her. A rush of warmth she didn't want to let go of. 18 months in, and every time he came back from a work trip away and kissed her like this, it was as though it was their first kiss all over again. "Well, I was getting a bit lonely," Evan said, "although that's definitely not the case now. And what would you know? I bumped into these guys outside." Holly peered behind Evan's shoulder to see an elderly couple, arms laden with shopping bags. From the way Evan had spoken, Holly assumed she was meant to recognize who Evan was with, but these people were entirely unfamiliar. "Sorry," she said, confused. "Do I know you?" "Well, we just wanted to get into the shop, get some sweets. Is there a reason you're blocking the door?" the man said. Holly stepped back, horribly embarrassed, and shook her head. I'm sorry. Yes, come in. As the couple walked into the shop, Holly saw who Evan was actually referring to. Her parents, Arthur and Wendy, were standing there, and in their arms, snugly wrapped in a snowflake-patterned all-in-one with her hood over her ears, was Holly's 2-year-old daughter, Hope. "Mummy, Evie's back," Hope said, her smile making Holly grin even wider. "He is back, isn't he? Come here, give Mummy a cuddle. What are you doing here? I thought you were at nursery now." "Yes, sorry about that," Evan said, a look of guilt flashing across his face. "I picked her up. I checked it was okay with Ben and your parents first, though. I just wanted a chance to see her, and I assumed you'd want to say hello and goodbye, too." Hello and goodbye? Holly was confused by the statement. In fact, she was confused by a lot of matters. Not only that Evan had turned up early without telling her he was coming, but also that her parents were there. If Evan was the one who'd picked Hope up, it seemed a ridiculous coincidence that they'd all turn up at the sweet shop at exactly the same time. "I'm sorry, I'm missing something," Holly said. "What's going on?" She looked at Jamie, who had hung around, though her face was as confused as Holly's. "Well, your dad needed to come down to look after the shop because we want to get going as quickly as possible," Evan replied. Get going?" Holly said, still confused. "Yes, I've booked us a weekend away, and before you start panicking and tell me how this is the second busiest time of the year for the shop, Caroline and Dre are on board and have sorted out covering your shifts, and Wendy is going to drop Hope with Ben after he finishes work. It's all arranged. But we can check in from 3, and it's a 4.5-hour drive, so let's get going, shall we?" Chapter 3. Despite Evan's obvious desire to get moving as quickly as possible, Holly still had a few questions. It wasn't that being whisked away wasn't exciting, but it was hard to get her head around it with such short notice. There were logistics to think about. Logistics she was sure Evan hadn't considered. "I'm sorry, where are we going?" she asked, hoping that a direct question would get a direct answer. Unfortunately, Evan wasn't going to fall for that. "If I told you, it wouldn't be a surprise, would it?" he said. "But I promise you're going to like it." "Okay, but why are we going away right now when, as you pointed out, it's the second busiest time of the year for me?" Out of the corner of her eye, Holly saw Jamie smirk as she pinched her ring finger. Thankfully, Evan was too busy looking at Holly to notice. "Because we deserve a weekend away. We've been so caught up with the house, I can't remember the last time you and I actually spent any proper time together relaxing. And we're not going to get a chance to do that with Christmas around the corner and my parents coming to stay. Still, I'd much rather we discuss this on the road than standing in your shop while the traffic gets worse and worse." "Fine," Holly conceded, If there was one thing she knew about Evan, it was that he was determined. If he'd decided they were going on a weekend away together, then that's what they were doing. I guess I need to go home and pack my things. She had barely finished speaking when her mother stepped forward. No, you don't. It's already done, she said. I've packed everything you'll need. Warm clothes, a swimsuit in case there's a hot tub, sensible shoes, and clean underwear. She glanced at Holly's father, and it was then that Holly noticed the large holdall he was carrying. And if there's anything we've forgotten, we can always buy it, Evan added. Holly looked around. The old couple, who had come in only a moment ago, looked like big spenders and were filling up their arms with boxes of fudge. Most people splashed their cash far more easily at this time of year, especially when the weather was nice. At that precise moment, a perfect blue winter sky hung above the frosted fields of the Cotswolds. It was that incredible type of weather that coerced everybody out of the house, as they worried they might not see a clear sky again for several more months. The shop was going to be busy, and even with two of them working, they would be run off their feet. But there was no way Holly could say no to Evan's surprise. Well, it looks like you've seen to everything, she said, which means I'm going to need a very big cuddle from you, Hopi. Holly took her daughter from her mother's arms and squeezed her tightly. Giving Hope a cuddle now was a far cry from what it had been when she was a baby. Now, Hope could really squeeze back as she wrapped her arms tightly around Holly's and planted a big kiss on her cheek. "Miss you, Mummy," she said, in the way she always did when she was spending a weekend with her dad, rather than Holly and Evan. "You're going to be a good girl for Daddy and Georgie, right?" Holly asked. "Hope is always a good girl," Hope replied, sweetly. "Is that right? Well, I'm going to miss you lots, and I'll send you lots of photos, okay?" It was the one advantage Holly found in the way her and Ben's relationship had worked out. She never felt guilty about leaving Hope. Ben was a brilliant parent, and Hope was in just as safe hands with him as she was with her. That didn't mean she didn't miss her terribly, though. "Hope, kiss Evie now?" Hope asked, breaking away from Holly to stretch her arms towards Evan. Holly could have felt jealous, as Hope planted double the number of kisses on Evan's cheeks as she had done for her. The hug lasted a fair bit longer too, but the sight made Holly's heart swell with disbelief that she shared so much love in her family. "Well, I guess I should get in there and serve the customers," her father said, stepping further into the shop. "And this is for you," he added, giving Holly the holdall. "My bag is already in the car," Evan said, passing Hope over to Holly's mother, planting one last kiss on her cheek. "It's time we get moving." Chapter 4. They were driving north. That was currently as much as Holly knew. So far, Evan had been less than forthcoming with information about their surprise trip away. He had a bag of similar size to hers in the boot of the car, but there was no suit hanging up, which meant they weren't doing anything formal. Holly was grateful for that. Formal dress required a substantial amount of time to sort out, even though, since being with Evan, she'd had more practice than ever before. Over the last 18 months, Evan had taken her to various fancy functions and charity auctions as part of his job. When possible, they turned such events into a weekend away, usually in London, and there was no way Holly would be happy with her mum packing for an evening like that. But they were driving away from the capital, and the fact there was no sign of a suit meant it'd probably just be the two of them this weekend. "If you won't tell me where we're going, can you at least tell me why we're going away?" she asked. "You do remember we have a perfectly wonderful house back in Clapton? One that we have spent the last year and a bit renovating? I am well aware of what we've been doing, Evan said. And I already told you, that's the reason we're heading away. We can't have a relaxing weekend at home, even when Ben has hope, because we always spot something in the house that needs doing. Something we haven't bought. Something that's not quite straight. It's impossible for you to switch off there, and don't pretend it's not. Holly tutted a little, but only because she knew he was right. The house they had bought together was the first ever home that Holly had owned, and it was magnificent. An unexpected inheritance from Maud, which still made Holly's heart throb to think about, combined with Evan's finances too, had enabled them to afford something she would have previously only dreamt about. 5 bedrooms, an enormous garden for Holly and Hope to play out in, an office for Evan, and plenty of space for when they expanded their family too. But Evan was right. All those rooms meant an awful lot of decorating, and even though the main spaces were all sorted, there were still so many things that needed doing. The spare bedroom was at the top of Holly's to-do list. It needed to be done before Evan's family came over for Christmas, but they were having a hard time settling on the colour scheme. Several tins of paint sat in the garage, waiting to be used, but Holly couldn't decide which would be the primary colour and which would be used for the accent wall. Perhaps they would get some inspiration from wherever they were staying, or perhaps she should just paint it whatever colour she grabbed first and be done with it. "You see why I wanted to go away?" Evan said. "And don't tell me you're not thinking about things that need to be done in the house. I know you are." Holly let out a resigned sigh. It was wonderful having someone who knew her as well as Evan did, but it could be a little frustrating too. "Okay, so I admit we get a bit distracted with house things, but that doesn't mean we need to go 4.5 hours drive away. There are plenty of perfectly nice places around Bourton in the Cotswolds, like Burford or Bilbury, all of which we've been to before on day trips. I want this to be different. I want us to remember this trip." Something fluttered in the pit of Holly's stomach as she thought about Jamie pointing to her ring finger. Was this why Evan wanted the trip to be special? Because he was going to propose? She shook her head and hurriedly cast the thought away. There was no way she was going to go into this weekend thinking that. Otherwise, she wouldn't be able to enjoy any of the moments they were sharing, fixating too much on when it was going to happen. "Well," she said, promising herself she wouldn't think about it again, "I guess if we've got a 4.5 hours journey to do, I should probably find us some decent music." Chapter 5. An hour and a half into the journey, they stopped for a drink and petrol, at which point Evan typed the address onto the sat-nav, and Holly finally knew where they were going. "Lake Windermere? We're going to the Lake District?" she asked, not bothering to hide her excitement. "I've never been there. I've never been to the Lake District." "I know," Evan replied. Holly glanced over her shoulder at the small bag of clothes her mother had packed for her. She hoped there were some jumpers in there. Snow had already fallen on several parts of the UK, including Bourton, but she knew from the news and general geography that the weather was bound to be colder and possibly snowy too, all that way up north. "So, we've got a little cottage booked," Evan said. "I haven't stayed there myself, but I've had friends who have, and they say the view is amazing. You can see all the way across the lake, and it's close enough that we can walk into town easily too. My current plan for the weekend is us cozying up on the sofa with a large supply of Christmas films. How does that sound to you?" "Oh, that sounds perfect." "And maybe a little walk to the lake too. You know I miss lakes." Almost all the stories Evan had told Holly about his childhood involved trips to the lake, although Holly had proven extremely ignorant about her knowledge of the USA when he told her these stories. She knew he grew up in Washington State, near Seattle, but the only images she'd had of such places were the ones implanted in her mind by films and television shows. It was only when Evan showed her a map of the region that his love of water, and lakes in particular, made sense. Given how much Evan travelled, he'd been keen for Holly and Hope to visit America and his family over there too, but so far it just hadn't panned out that way. Last year, his eldest sister had been going through a tricky divorce, and they decided it was better if he went over alone. Besides, Holly had felt funny about the idea of Hope spending Christmas away from Ben, and so they'd all had a quiet do at Jamie and Finn's. Still, Holly had met one of Evan's sisters, Ashley. Like Evan, she was the only other one in the family to move abroad, though she still used her parents' place in Seattle as a base while she travelled around working for various charities and NGOs. That summer, she'd had a couple of weeks' vacation, and so they met in the villa in France. She and Holly had got on like a house on fire, with Holly feeling like she had known her for years. Fingers crossed, it would be the same with Evan's parents. "So, now you know where we're going, can you stop fussing about that?" Evan asked. "And tell me, how is Jamie doing? She looked relaxed at the shop." Lately, any conversation that didn't revolve around the house or Hope steered towards Jamie and Finn's impending arrival. "Has Finn told you if they're having a boy or a girl?" Holly asked, already suspecting she knew the answer. "No, but I know he's desperate to share it." "You know, they won't even discuss names with each other," Holly said. "They tried it once and got into a massive argument, and so now they've made a decision that they're not going to suggest anything until they meet the baby and can agree on what they look like." "I don't get that," Evan said. "I don't see how some people think that babies look like a certain name. They all look like old men to me. If I was in charge of naming babies based on what I thought they looked like, they'd all have names like Wilfred or Norman." Holly chuckled. When Hope was born, she had been, without a doubt, the most beautiful thing she had ever seen in the world. But, objectively, yes, there was a chance that she looked like a crinkled old man too. "I think Jamie's going stir-crazy," Holly said. "It might be the shortest maternity leave in history." "Well, UK history," Evan said. "They don't do maternity leave in the States." Holly's jaw dropped. "What? You're not serious?" Let's not get into US politics right now. Anyway, we need to think of a gift. Something amazing. I was thinking a mini quad bike." "For a newborn baby?" Holly exclaimed. "You don't get a newborn baby a quad bike." "I know, but we need to make sure that Uncle Evan and Auntie Holly are the most favourite uncle and auntie in the group. There's going to be competition, you know, with Ben, Georgia, Michael, and Caroline, and Giles is going to try and cement his position as the favourite uncle too. I can't believe it, that him and Jamie didn't used to get on. It seems ridiculous, given how close they are now." Since Holly had moved back to Borton, Giles's activity had been the most unstable point of stability in her life. There was a time at the beginning of their friendship when she thought they were dating, but then she'd realised he'd actually just wanted to get his hands on her business. Then, it was later on, when he was genuinely serious about being with her, that Holly became pregnant with Hope, Ben's child. Still, the friendship was quickly healed, unlike Jamie and Giles's, with Jamie refusing to ever let him into her house again. And yet, last year, because of Jamie's wedding, Giles had healed that wound too. They were all a close-knit group, the way she had always hoped they would be, but it was fair to say it had taken a great number of ups and downs to get them to this point. The closer they got to the Lake District, the more the landscape changed. "I thought the Cotswolds were hilly," Holly said, as she looked out at the undulating mountains that rose and fell around them. The landscape was unlike anything she had seen or imagined. The earth, barren from cold months, was, as she'd already suspected, white with snow. As they rose up on the little mountain parts, lakes glimmered beneath them, silvery in the fading light. "There are some amazing hikes and walks around here," Evan said, sparking a nervous fluttering in Holly's stomach. "Hikes? You said we were watching movies, not hiking. I'm not sure I've got the boots for that. Not in weather like this." Evan laughed. "Don't worry. The last thing I want is to be responsible for you slipping down and breaking an ankle. But maybe in the summer, if we like this cottage, we could bring Hope back here and do some walks. Or we could do them on our own, if she's with Ben." "That sounds nice." Holly was only half listening. Instead, she was gazing out at the scenery, mesmerized by the magnificence of it all. For years, she had been so desperate to travel and see the world, but now she felt like she'd never really appreciated what was on her doorstep. "I think I'm definitely going to like it here," Holly said, turning to Evan and flashing him a smile. "Let's hope so." He grinned back. Chapter 6. Holly was no novice when it came to cute countryside cottages, but the place Evan had picked for them to stay was everything she could have dreamt of and more. While the cottage she had lived in with Hope had been idyllic, with its Cotswold stone walls and enclosed garden, it had been child-friendly. A place made for living full-time, and as such, practicality was its main function. This cottage was pure luxury. "Yep, I'm never going to leave," Holly said, as she dropped onto a large cream sofa and sank into the deep cushions. There was no way she could have a cream sofa in her house, not with Hope. But it suited the space here perfectly. Everything suited the space. Wooden beams braced the ceiling, whilst there was an entire wall in the living area that functioned as a bookshelf, filled with beautiful leather-bound hardbacks. A large sheepskin rug sat on the floor in front of the open fire, and Holly couldn't help but think of some of those romance films she'd seen where an unsuspecting couple, with a strong dislike for each other, got trapped in the snow over the winter and fell hopelessly in love. Of course, she was already in love. "So, there's a hot tub outside and a jacuzzi bath in the ensuite," Evan said, smiling broadly. "You're joking!" "I'm not. I know what my girl likes." Evan was right. Holly loved a bath. Baths were her favourite way to while away an evening. But having the choice of a hot tub as well, it was a good job her mother had packed that swimsuit for her. This really was going to be a weekend where she didn't think about work or jobs to do on the house. She was just going to relax. "I didn't get a food chop done before we left," Evan said, still standing in the doorway, although Holly was very much in holiday mode as she spread out along the sofa. "There's a little shop down the road. Why don't I go fetch a few things and you can have a long bath? Or you can get in the hot tub and wait for me to get back." Holly considered the offer. Part of her quite wanted to go for a walk with Evan and see a little more of the area where they were staying. But she knew that this weekend he wanted to take care of her, and there would be plenty of time over the next couple of days to go for a wander. Still, the hot tub sounded like something she wanted to do with him. "I'm going to have a bath, then," she said. "I probably need one anyway." "Wonderful. Well, there should be toiletries and everything there," Evan said, And I'll bring you up a glass of wine when I get back. How does that sound? That sounds like you're the best boyfriend in the world, and I am ridiculously lucky to have you, Holly said with a grin. Well, I'm not going to disagree with that, Evan replied, kissing her gently. I'll be back in a bit. Make yourself at home. Right. I guess we're staying for a couple of nights, so I should probably put the clothes away in the wardrobe. It was more of a thought that Holly had voiced, rather than a question, but rather than agreeing, Evan reached down and snatched his bag up from by his feet. No, absolutely not. You're not to lift a finger, you understand? I'll put these bags in the car if that's what you're gonna do. You'll put the bags back in the car? Holly said, laughing at the comment. I mean it. Yep, I'm taking them with me. He hoisted both bags onto his shoulder and went to turn around. Hold on, I need my wash things out of there. Evan frowned. Fine, I'll leave yours here, but you're not to do any unpacking, okay? Now, I need to go get some wine before the shop shuts. You know what these local stores are like with closing at crazy early times. Just make sure you do nothing, okay? You've made it pretty clear that's all I'm allowed to do, Holly said, before stepping forward and kissing again. Perhaps if I'm still in the bath when you get back, you can join me. Sounds perfect, Evan grinned, before opening the door and heading back to the car, still with his bag on his shoulder. As Holly ran the oversized tub, she thought about how ridiculous it was, Evan taking his bag with him just because he didn't want her unpacking anything. But it was when she stepped inside the bath that a sudden thought struck. One so ridiculous it couldn't possibly be true. What if the reason Evan didn't want her to go through his bag and unpack wasn't because he wanted her to relax, but because there was something in there he didn't want her to see? Was Jamie right? Was Evan actually going to propose? Chapter 7. Holly lay in the bath, trying to relax, and yet she couldn't shake the idea from her head. Could that really be why Evan didn't want her to look in his bag? Because there was a ring in there? No, she tried to quash the thought. If he'd bought something as precious and expensive as an engagement ring, he wouldn't just put it in his rucksack and dump it on the floor, would he? Jamie had put ideas into her head, that was all. She was reading too much into things. Just as Evan had said, there were plenty of luxury bath goodies next to the tub in a wicker basket. Everything from fizzing bath bombs to luxury oils. Having already used a small packet of the bath salts, Holly went to open a bath bomb, only to change her mind. Her mum loved things like this. If she left it all unopened, she could take everything back and give it to her as a gift. Besides, it wasn't like the bath wasn't luxury enough, with its bubbling jets and perfect view from the window out over the Lake District. For a few minutes, Holly did nothing but stare. Lazy snowflakes drifted down from the sky. Probably not enough to settle, but enough to once again make her feel like she was the main character in some grand romance novel. The hot tap continued to run, though Holly's eyes were closed, and she was just drifting off when she heard the door downstairs open. So, there wasn't much in the way of food at the shop, but they had wine, and there are a couple of local takeaways, Evan said as he came up the stairs. He poked his head around the corner, only to grin at the sight of Holly, soaking away in pure bliss. Or I could just bring the bottle of wine up here, and we could skip dinner altogether. He came across to the bath, leant over Holly, and planted a long kiss on her lips. Not once had Holly found a kiss with Evan to be average. Even the pecks on the forehead or quick kisses on the cheek before he went out caused a ripple of warmth to flood through her. She had always thought she'd be worried about having a boyfriend who travelled, after the situation with her ex cheating on her, but she hadn't worried about it once with Evan. He was so completely in love with Holly and Hope that she sometimes needed to pinch herself to believe it was real. As she drew a deep breath in and sat up, Holly's stomach growled loudly, loud enough to be heard over the bath jets. Evan raised an eyebrow. "Perhaps we should go for food and an early night," he said. "Why don't I grab you the menu for the Indian now? That's the one the woman at the shop recommended. They said there's about a 40-minute wait, so we can ring up now, and then I'll go down and grab it when it's ready, if that sounds okay." "Oh, that sounds perfect. But I don't have to get out of the bath yet, do I?" Holly asked. "No," Evan laughed as he shook his head. "You don't have to get out of the bath yet." When she did finally get out of the bath, Holly intended on getting dressed in some clean clothes, or perhaps even her night clothes, though she hadn't actually checked what her mum had packed. But when she opened up the wardrobe in the bedroom, she found 2 white, fluffy dressing gowns, the type you found in luxury spas, and the moment Holly ran her hand over the fabric, any thoughts of her own clothes were forgotten. She was going to relax properly this weekend. By the time she finally came back downstairs to the living room, Evan already had the fire roaring away and was lying on the sofa, reading. "Food is going to be another 10 minutes, he said, looking up from his book. "I was going to ask if you wanted to walk down with me, but I guess that's a no." "Well, someone has to stay in the house and keep an eye on this fire you've built," Holly said with a smirk. "You're very right, of course you do. How responsible of us. But if you want me to get anything else, I'll have to do it now. The weather is getting seriously cold out, and according to the woman at the shop, the temperature's going to drop further overnight. I'm not leaving the house again after this." "Good. I don't want you to," Holly said, leaning over to kiss him. When she finally broke away, Holly's gaze shifted past Evan and out of the window. The sun had well and truly set, but the street lamps were casting the sky in a hazy orange light, and the thin dusting of snowflakes continued to flutter down. "We should probably check the weather forecast. We don't want to get snowed in," she said. "Oh, no. That would be the worst thing in the world." Evan smirked as he kissed her again, before glancing down at his watch. "I should probably head to the takeaway place now. The pavement was so slippery on the way here. I nearly fell flat on my back. I don't want to be rushing." "If you break something, I won't be happy," Holly said, raising an eyebrow. "No? I think I'm owed some looking after. Remember the way I nursed you with your broken arm? Or have you forgotten about that?" "We'll see," Holly said, spying her book on the arm of the chair. Evan must have told her mum to pack it for her. "Well, I shouldn't be too long. Don't get into any trouble while I'm gone." It was only when the front door closed and Holly moved to sit down and grab her book that her eyes fell on the novel Evan had been reading. He must have brought his bag inside and unpacked it, probably while she was still happily soaking away in the tub. Holly's chest fluttered at the thought of the bag that he had tried so hard to keep away from her. If there was anything else hiding in it, now was the time to look. Chapter 8. Holly was a bad girlfriend. She knew she was. In fact, what she was doing probably went beyond being a bad girlfriend and made her a bad person in general. But her mind wouldn't rest until she knew whether Evan was planning on proposing. She needed to find out if he had brought a ring with him, although what she would do if he had, she wasn't yet sure. Obviously, she would have to pretend she hadn't seen it. That much was common sense. But then what? Would she just act as normal as possible, while secretly spending every minute wondering if this was the moment he was going to do it? What other choice would she have? None. There were no advantages to finding out if Evan had brought a ring with him. She was being ridiculous. Holly knew that, and yet she couldn't stop. 2 minutes, she said to herself as she stepped into the bedroom and opened the wardrobe door. You can look for 2 minutes. If you don't find it by then, you have to stop and stop thinking about it too. The strange thing was, until this weekend, Holly really hadn't been that fussed about whether Evan was going to propose. It wasn't like it had been with her first boyfriend, Dan, when getting married had been the ultimate goal. There had been a long list of prerequisites, of course, like buying a house together and making sure they were financially stable, doing everything properly. Now, Holly was eternally grateful that never happened. What had felt like the worst thing she could ever have experienced, Dan cheating on her, had been the catalyst for the most amazing years of her life. As odd as it was, she was grateful to him for it. But with Evan, life together was an inevitability. It didn't matter if they got married next week or in 10 years' time. It didn't matter if he proposed in some cute...